she asked what it was about, and she said, so you completed it? And I said, yes. And again, this is the 70s, so you have to imagine everyone lived in this veil of smoke in the 70s, right? Everyone was smoking. And so my mother sat there like this, and she said, you know, your fiction could be someone else's fact, and that could be scary. This was so over my head. I went into my bedroom as a 9-year-old. My fiction is someone else's fact. Stacy's mom doesn't like the book. Stacy's mom is having adventures with a man in a van. And I told Stacy that. So this was really, went from bad to worse. And I tell you this because it stole my courage. What kid wants to be at the center of an enduring drama, you know, and a scandal and something embarrassing and humiliating? And I had written a sequel that never saw the light of day because it stole my courage. And I didn't write another story for over 20 years. And Mrs. Zimmer, my teacher, was so amazing. She was like, don't let this discourage you. You completed it. It was just, you know, a little inappropriate. But that followed me. And so instead of telling my own stories, for 22 years, I worked in the music business. And I helped artists and musicians and songwriters and music producers and film composers. I helped them tell stories, but through music. And they weren't my own stories. But what I realized, and what I was discussing at dinner with my sister and niece, was that when we include a piece of ourself and a piece of emotional truth into whatever project we're working on, whether it's a story or a song, there's an emotional resonance. Maybe it's a vulnerability, but it feels real. And I noticed in the music business that songs that did contain that kernel of emotional truth, they became hits. So I started asking the question, well, what's your story? Well, what's your story? And finally, one of my musicians turned to me and said, okay, Sepetys, what's your story? I said, oh, my story, I'm Lithuanian. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry. How long have you had that? I said, no, AJ, Lithuania is a country, and my father is from Lithuania. And he said, on the atlases in my school, I don't think Lithuania was on the map. And to his point, for 50 years, Lithuania was not on the map. Some of you here know, it's just Soviet Union. Some of you here are Lithuanian. But this musician said, no, that's unacceptable. That can't be your story because I don't know what it means to be Lithuanian. I have no idea. You can't just say that. I don't know. What does it mean to be Lithuanian? And I knew part of the answer. I knew my father was born in Lithuania, and when he was 4 years old, when Stalin occupied, because my grandfather was a military officer, there was a danger, and military officers were being put on lists for execution and deportation. So my father fled and lived for 9 years in DP camps and refugee camps before coming to the United States. And that was the part of the story that I knew. But when I went to Lithuania and began investigating, I realized I really only knew part of my story. The part that I didn't know was that after so many people fled from Lithuania, the Soviets arrested and deported countless people to labor camps and death camps in Siberia. And this was part of my family story because my grandfather's extended family had been deported. This was part of my heritage, and I didn't know this history. And I thought, how can I not know this history? And if I don't know this story, certainly people who aren't Lithuanian don't know this story. So I was inspired to write a book, One Girl, Her Dream of Freedom, and a voice to speak for countless victims of communism who never had a chance to tell their story. And that simple question, what's your story? It changed my life. And now I am an author of historical fiction. I've written 4 novels, Between Shades of Grey, often mistaken for 50 Shades of Grey. Still, I keep thinking this is going to fade away. Lithuania has never looked so sexy. But still, so Between Shades of Grey, my second novel, Out of the Easy, my third novel, Salt to the Sea, and my latest novel, The Fountains of Silence, which I'm hoping to speak to you a bit about tonight. And writing historical fiction has taught me so much, but most importantly, it's taught me that progress is possible. and really the power of sharing our story. So I wanted to speak a bit about that and speak a bit about writing, take some questions, and then of course sign books. But through historical fiction, I've learned that when history is hidden in the shadows, the people who have experienced that history, sometimes they might think that the world has forgotten them, and that is not the case. We have not forgotten them. We just don't know their story. So I look for those underrepresented parts of history, stories of strength through struggle, stories of resilience, stories that might have slipped through the cracks. And I try to wrap fictional characters around them and bring them out of the dark. So my latest novel, The Fountains of Silence, it's set in 1957 in Madrid, Spain, during the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. And when I told a few people that I was writing a novel set in Spain during the Franco dictatorship, one of my friends said, "Oh, Spain, I love Spain. I've been several times. Remind me, who's Franco?" And these names, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, when we think of dictators, we know these names because we teach the villains' names. But we might not know as much about Franco. And when I toured in Spain for my first book, Between Shades of Grey, the people in Spain and Basque Country and Catalonia, they were so compassionate toward the hidden history of the Baltics and the people who had experienced it, and also people of Poland, people of Romania. They came to book events, and when I was discussing the history, they were in tears. They were so compassionate, and it made me want to reciprocate. And I asked them, I said, "Well, tell me, what's your story?" And they said, "Oh, Ruta, our story, it's way too complex for outsiders to understand." And then another woman said, "Honestly, our history, our story, it's too painful." And that resonated with me because having Baltic history, I understand so many people who suffered in silence. And I couldn't accept that. I wanted to know more. And I told my publisher, I really want to write about Spain. However, I am not Spanish, nor do I speak Spanish. And what right do we have to history other than our own? And so in 2010-11, I decided I wanted to write about Spain. But it took me 7 years to research and write this story, because if I was going to do it authentically, I had to be very careful. I had to be very respectful. But it was the compassion of the Spanish people that inspired this whole thing. And when I sat down with people, they said, "There's something that they're not telling you." They said, "Many of us had cardboard fathers, Ruta." And I didn't know what that meant. What is a cardboard father? And they explained that after the Spanish Civil War, the families who had opposed Franco, they were in peril. There was such punishment after the Civil War. People were executed, families, they just remained silent. They couldn't let people know that they had had a father or a grandfather who had fought against Franco. And so for many of them, they couldn't even hang a photograph on the wall of their ancestor who had opposed Franco. And so they told me that they took that cardboard photo and they put them either next to the bed, under the bed, or in the bedside table. And a woman told me, when I wanted to see my dad, I went into my mom's room and I opened that bedside table and I looked at that photo. And she said, the other thing that they're not telling you is that Franco ruled for 36 years. And in 1975, when Franco died, Spain was faced with the Herculean task of moving toward democracy and building a democracy. And they decided after 36 years, it would be too difficult to prosecute alleged offenses. So in 1977, an amnesty law was passed. And then that was followed by what is known as the Pact of Forgetting. And they agreed to forget. And that just astonished me. How do we forget history? You know, knowledge of history, knowledge of the past gives context to the present. But these people, they had adopted the Pact of Forgetting. So this is how I came into this whole project. And I quickly realized, oh, this is more challenging than I thought. And the people of Spain were right. It's so difficult for an outsider to understand. And my other novels, all three of those novels, they contain threads of my personal family history. I was able to write those novels from the inside out. But writing The Fountains of Silence, I realized I was going to have to write from the outside in. So I decided to write an American in Spain, someone like myself who was desperate to understand and reciprocate, but just couldn't quite grasp what was going on. The book is set in 1957 and follows Daniel Matheson, the son of a Texas oil man from Dallas, who comes to Madrid the summer after he graduates from high school. And in Madrid, he meets Anna, a Spanish girl working at the hotel. And together, they embark upon a journey that unknowingly puts both of their lives in danger. So we have an American boy and a Spanish girl. They're desperate to connect and understand one another, but they're fenced by fear and silence and circumstance. How can they bridge the width between them? I started by reading all the nonfiction possible, memoirs, testimonies, academic papers, dissertations, and then I traveled to Madrid and I rented an apartment, and feet on the ground, I started walking the paths of the characters, and I sat down with human beings who were true witnesses, who had experienced the Civil War, who had lost their parents or their grandparents. I also met with people who said, please understand, my family were Francoists. We didn't suffer. And in writing historical fiction, I want to give a balanced portrayal because history has many angles. And many people during these historic time periods, they were children. Decisions were made for them. And so I want to represent that. And it was absolutely fascinating. There was so much that I didn't know. I didn't know that during the Franco dictatorship, there was no freedom of speech. There was no freedom of religion. Franco was really trying to isolate Spain. The train tracks were purposely a different width to control entries and exits. There was no freedom of the press, and I don't just mean media. Publishers, what they published was controlled. Some books were banned. Bookstores, their inventory was controlled. Textbooks were written by the government and by the Catholic Church. There were no equal rights. Women had to request special permission if they wanted a passport or to open a bank account. In many cases, they needed permiso marital. They needed the permission of their husband. I didn't know that although Franco was so elusive and so isolated, that in the 50s, I knew about the Pact of Madrid, but Franco opened up the country and started doing business with foreigners, the United States. And because the United States was amidst the Cold War and needed a position against the Soviets, they bartered a deal with Franco to put 2 military installations in Spain. Franco also was working with the Hollywood movie studios, and Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra and all of these celebrities were flooding into Spain and enjoying the sunshine and wine amidst this dictatorship. I also didn't know that Franco was doing business with these Texas oil barons. And so there were some oil men in Texas, and I read news reports that said that, you know, a bar in Madrid sounded like roundup time in the Panhandle because there were so many Texans in Madrid at the time. But also something that fascinated me, the very first Hilton hotel in Europe, Conrad Hilton's, enterprise. The first hotel in Europe, it wasn't in Paris or Rome. That's what I would have thought, first Hilton. It was in Madrid. Conrad Hilton was doing business with Franco. And I was so fascinated by this. So I went into the presidential archives. I went into the diplomatic archives to see what the correspondence was. And it was so fascinating and so mind-blowing what was going on